Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us online. Thank you for joining us here. This is our first hybrid event for the Grad Talk. So I'm really happy that we have a lot of people here. I'm going to do it a bit awkwardly like this so that the people online see that we have lots of participants here. So thanks again for joining. My name is Lisa and I work for Searle. And today we have Lindsay with us, who is going to present her very preliminary findings from her dissertation. I'm just not going to say a lot because you've all read the flyer, you're all interested, and that's why you're here. So we're really grateful for you to be here. I'm just going to say that the Searle Grad Talk is actually very informal. So it's not supposed to be a finished research project, it's not supposed to be a finished, polished anything. It's more for Lindsay to present her stuff and to get feedback. And so this is why I'm inviting you basically to really put your ideas whenever we get to the feedback round to really participate and let Lindsay know what you think. Okay. All right, so without further ado, I hope our online participants, you can hear us well, right? So far? Yes, okay, great. Some people might still be joining, but that's okay. So I'll just admit them and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, so I'm gonna unmute myself. Can folks hear me okay online? Yes, okay, wonderful. So I know everyone here. It's really lovely to see you all. As Lisa said, this is very preliminary. So this is actually my first time sharing some data from my PhD project. Thanks for kind of filling out the poll, because I did want a sense, and it seems like people have an idea, but maybe not a whole bunch of context. So I'll try to explain as much as I can. If you have any questions, feel free to stop me, okay? So just to let you know, femme is both an identity and it's a theory. So it's kind of like queer in that sense. It's a term that historically and presently many to us LGBTQI+ folks take up. It's often people who kind of perform or embody, reclaim queer femininity and try to find ways to, push back against the confines of like patriarchal femininity. As a theory and as an analytic, there's lots of different approaches and ways that folks are talking about it. But within kind of queer theorizing, femme has actually been something that's been kind of devalued. So when queer theory came along, it kind of eclipsed gay and lesbian studies, and feminist and femininity was actually seen as something that wasn't very radical or progressive. And so femme theory is kind of a turn to reclaim things. Things like, when I get to talking about softness, have to do with emotionality, vulnerability, things that have been pathologized and deemed kind of lesser and not radical. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about my positionality, and I'll talk about who I collaborated with, because they're the real stars of this research. So you all kind of know me here, but I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in curriculum and pedagogy. I'm a former high school teacher, so I taught in a Greater Victoria School District, Maria Montessori School, and I also taught in a remote Ojibwe community in North Spirit Lake First Nation, which is in so-called Northern Ontario. I'm white, I have British, French, and Irish ancestry. I'm cisgender, which just means I align with the sex I was assigned at birth. I'm lesbian, queer, I use those terms interchangeably. I resonate with being femme, so that's my connection, insider. I have chronic illness stuff, and I also have mental health stuff, and kind of, I'm not going to talk a lot about MAD theory, but this framework does connect with MAD studies and MAD theory as well. So these are just going to be preliminary stuff. I'm going to share some data, and I'll also talk about my methodology. So who are the 8 people that I co-researched with? These are the amazing individuals I worked with. About half the group were educators, half the group were youth. They were specifically older youth, because I didn't really want the headache of trying to get permission from underage folks, especially as that's challenging for queer and trans individuals who might not be out. Everyone resonated with feminist in some way. Doesn't mean they use that to self-identify necessarily, but they they connected with it and they wanted to conceptualize kind of femme ways of knowing and thinking. The majority of the people in the project were either Indigenous or they were racialized. So 2 of them were First Nations, 1 was Métis, 3 were racialized, 1 was a second generation Chinese human, 1 was Bangladeshi, 1 had Goan, Indian, Hungarian, and English ancestry, and 2 were white. About 5 of the people were kind of broadly under the trans modality or umbrella. They use terms like non-binary, gender fluid, agender, trans, NB to describe themselves. 1 person, they didn't really say what their gender identity was, but they used the pronouns she and they, which could suggest some fluidity. 2 people were cis, and everyone described their sexuality in fluid ways. So it's really interesting because femme actually comes more from working class, white and Black lesbian bar scenes. It's a term where it's like femme was used historically to describe more feminine presenting lesbians and queer women, and butch was to describe kind of masculine. But what we see today is that femme is really not tied to that kind of binary way of thinking. It's a lot more expansive, and it's something that a lot of people take up, and they're trying to just like push past even the binaries, right, of where the term kind of often came from. 1 person identified as a demisexual survivor, and they talked about being part of the ACE community, but that being connected to their experiences of domestic and sexual violence. We had folks who were educators. 2 people were working in First Nation schools. 1 person was a teacher candidate, counseling student. We had 2 community educators doing a PhD. We had some students. And then everyone described having a mental illness and or some other disability as well. So we had folks who described neurodiversity, being part of that community. We had folks describing being part of having learning disabilities, chronic illnesses. So there was a variety of experiences represented. But of course, there were lots of people who weren't represented, but it's a small group. It is what it is. People joined from across Canada, or so-called Canada, Turtle Island. There were 2 people who joined from BC, from those traditional territories. We had 5 people from so-called Ontario. There was 3 people from Toronto, 1 person from Burlington, Ottawa, and then we had someone who was joining from Nova Scotia. So we all like joined for 6 months. These people were very dedicated over Zoom. And you might be wondering, what did we actually do? So we met and we created art. We crafted. We talked about what is softness? What could softness offer to education? How do we want schools to be different? Because everybody in this project felt a lot of conflicted feelings about schooling systems. We wanted schools to look differently. And so we were using this framework of softness, which I'll explain a little bit more, as a sort of anchor. So at the beginning of the process, it was focused on us getting to know each other. So I did a one-on-one interview with everybody. We had an orientation session where we crafted. We talked about our feelings. We said who we are. And then in the new year, from January to March, that's when we really started creating these dream maps, which were pieces of art that could range from like doing a painting to doing like found poetry to some multimedia stuff. And each month had a different prompt. So January was, how could the time and space, so the physical and psychological architecture of K-12 schools be soft? February was, how could pedagogy be soft? And March was, how could curriculum be soft? And at the beginning, they got the prompts. There was optional art making sessions that they could come to. And then at the end of the month, we all came together, we met on Zoom, and then we analyzed the art together. And we did that using a descriptive review process. So like, kind of imagine if we were all on Zoom, one by one, we would kind of share our art. We would say what it meant to us. And then people would go around and just in positive or neutral kind of language, be like, I'm noticing this in your art. noticing that. And we just paid attention to what was coming up, right? And we kind of compared that to see some initial themes that were coming out. Following that, so last month, that was like wrap up. So we had a debrief meeting where we discussed what we want to do with the art that was created. And then I did exit interviews with everyone. Throughout that whole period of time, because I'm an overachiever, I was like, oh, maybe there should be optional workshops that people can attend so they can learn about art making and queer. Claudia, you're like looking at me, you're like, I know, this is you. So these were folks who are part of the 2S LGBTQI+ community, who resonate with feminists in some way. And they did workshops on different things like cross stitch, drag, like confessional poetry writing. We had someone do a workshop on embodiment. So these were all opportunities. People didn't have to go to those workshops, but they could. And they could learn and think more about softness and what kind of artistic mediums they wanted to use. So dream mapping is the methodology that I employed, and it's something that I've been developing as part of my PhD. I just published a piece on it. So if you want to read more about it, I don't want to take up too much time kind of talking about it, but it draws on arts-based methods and participatory informed methods, and it kind of animates ideas of queer, feminine, and crip failure, which Claudia and I have talked a little bit about. But yeah, it was really intentionally a project that was asking people to use mediums that have been feminized, that have been devalued, as a way to try to reclaim and say, what could be generative possibly about creating art that's like been seen as part of the domestic sphere, like sewing or doing like textiles or doing cross stitch, and using it as a tool to theorize together. It also kind of plays off this idea of participation and participatory research, which are people here familiar with participatory research? Yeah. So a lot of the expectations around PR is that people at every stage of that process help co-create it, which is like really beautiful. And it's meant to be this really liberatory approach. It's meant to disrupt binaries and hierarchies. But the thing is, it can be really challenging for people with chronic health issues, for people with mental health issues, various disabilities. It can also be really hard as a graduate student, like no money, and it requires relationship building. So I wanted to think through maybe the idea of intentionally failing at participatory research, this idea of expanding what participation can look like and how we can crip and how we can madden what participation might look like and what it might be. So people could show up in the ways that they wanted to. I tried to take labor and ask people like, what are you interested in? What are you not interested in? And to try to distribute it that way. So my research questions, I was really interested in how people were conceptualizing softness. So, and again, I know I haven't fully explained that, so I will, but both as a subjectivity and as a way of knowing, valuing, and being that could be applied to education. And I was looking at like their speech, their art making process, artistic representations, the actual art they created, behaviors, what happened when we were in these virtual spaces together, how people showed up, and thinking about what effective and speculative geographies were created in those spaces. Like, were we actually being soft? Like, how do we know if we're being soft or not? What does that look like? Were there barriers to being soft? So at this point, you might be like, Lindsay, can you explain what you mean by soft? Because I've been saying it a lot. Softness is a concept that comes from femme theory. And I draw really heavily on this person right here, Andy Schwartz. So she has written about, and she has these really cool zines that are called Soft Femme. She talks about how softness is an orientation to the world that foregrounds vulnerability, emotionality, and earnestness. So she actually did an internet study. It was an ethnographic study where she looked at femme culture on the internet and how like queer femmes are representing themselves, how they're showing up. And she found that in the past decade or so, there's been this turn towards softness. There used to be this kind of aesthetic to be hard, to be like, I'm going to wear leather and like have knives and like take up space and be super unapologetic. And how there's been this kind of turn in aesthetic and ways that people are showing up where they're like, pastels, soft colors, I want to talk about my feelings. And so I wanted to kind of think about some of her work and how might this idea of kind of emotionality and vulnerability be generative or useful in like the education world. And I think it works really well with this idea of like dreaming about how schools could be different. So these are my data collection sources. There's like transcripts, the art, observations I had. And as I mentioned, there was a descriptive review that the co-dreamers did together. And there's also a thematic analysis that I'm doing on my own. So there's different layers. And I'm honestly still trying to figure out how to like make sure that I'm doing it in a way that feels good for me as someone trying to do participatory research. Like how can I share that labor, right? And make sure that I'm not inserting too much of my own voice and making sure that what other folks have said is really coming through. So if you have any ideas on that, I welcome it. And these are some reasons why I wanted to do this research. I wanted to do dreaming kind of work because I wanted to think through like Eve Tuck's provocations for more desired-centered work, because in queer and trans educational studies, a lot of scholars have been talking about how we focus so much on like this queer and trans suffering trope. We look at damage, we look at languishing mental health, we look at people suffering, we look at bullying. That's all we focus on. And it just creates these narratives that we're like stuck and we can't do anything about it. So I wanted to think about like queer and trans people, like we have amazing ways of knowing and being and valuing in the world. Why don't we kind of lean into that and why don't we center it? So I'm drawing on this idea of like queer cultural capital and kind of queer worlds making, or what Jose Muniz would call queer utopias, right? And I want to focus on femmes because, as I mentioned before, femme folks are not always centered. In queer theory, in social spaces, and I think it has to do, again, with how feminized labor, like care work and other things, are often devalued. They're seen as like not super rational, not super vigorous, right? But it's really, really important to highlight, especially because like Black, Latinx, Indigenous, like femme, queer, and trans people have been leading activist movements. Like they have been at the center of all this work and so often overlooked, right? And that's the same for like disability activists who are also racialized. So it's important to kind of highlight these perspectives that are often not named, especially because like homophobia and transphobia, if you look at the rates of violence, like say in schools, the majority of people who are victimized are like AMAB, so assigned male at birth, folks who are gender nonconforming. They present in more feminine ways, and they're often the ones who are victimized. Even people who are not necessarily part of queer and trans communities, they can be victims of homophobic and transphobic bullying. So femphobia, like the hatred of and the devaluing of femininity and what's associated with it, is something that's really overlooked and is super important. And softness is just a cool thing, I think, to think about, and it hasn't really been brought to education. Okay, this is a lot of me talking and rambling, but I'm going to get into sharing some data. And I would really love your thoughts because it's really rough. I was like, before it, like, okay, these are very much a work in progress. And I'm just focusing on one small aspect, which is curriculum, thinking about how might curriculum connect with this idea of softness, right? And how folks in the project were talking about softness, how they were trying to enact softness. And I feel like I need to say that when I'm talking about it, I understand curriculum in this way as like a set of values around what is worth teaching and learning about. So these are things that I feel like people in this project were suggesting are worth teaching and learning about when it comes to softness. So the first thing is this idea of like leaning into ease. So giving ourselves permission to do less and not kind of tying our worth to productivity, which I don't know how many people here feel guilty when you don't do things and when you're not super productive. Probably most of us, right? Because that's what we've internalized. It's like part of our value. A second piece that I think is really important is something that Jay, one of the participants, said, which is that softness is both a privilege and a want. Softness is racialized 110%. It's also not always accessible to people when they're in different states of survival. So a lot of people talked about healing in relation to softness and how they could access being soft through like community spaces where it was modeled to them, or therapy, or going through different forms of recovery, or being part of activist work and seeing people show up and model kind of vulnerability, but how they were actually taught that being soft is really weak. And so this idea of like, how do we acknowledge that it takes time and it takes space? And that kind of comes to the third point, which is that it's probably really important that there's grace for this process of unlearning hardness, because it's something that most of us have internalized, and especially people who've experienced different forms of systemic oppression, because they're just trying to survive really brutal systems. So I'm going to show some data, and this relates to the first kind of value, which is the idea of do less, and like you're enough. You can just show up as who you are. So the one on the left is a dream map that S created, and the picture on the right is a dream map that T created. So I'll kind of zoom in on this one right here. So for folks that can't see the fine print, because I also have to like get really close, it's a piece of paper that's been placed on top of a pile of dirty laundry that S was like, listen, I was exhausted this week. Like, I didn't know what to do for this dream map. I was feeling really tired. My mental health has been crap lately. I haven't been able to do my laundry. And they talked about wanting to create this piece of paper that kind of reminded them of things they had to do in elementary school. Did anyone have to write those sheets of paper where you like write the date at the top and your name, and then there's like those underlined things, right? So S kind of recreated that. They have the date, they have homework, and then they have underlined, I don't want to write, I don't want covered. I don't want the neatness and lines and order when I feel like my head is about to explode. So I want, and then they ended up drawing all these other things, right? They drew like a tree, a raindrop, all these squiggly lines, right? And they wrote things like, is solitude rude? Look and see the other ways I can learn off the lines, off the page, softer ways. I can draw, dance, sing, live, skip, jump, create, love. Let me cry, let me scream, let me hold softness. So I think that I wanted to highlight this dream map because I thought it was really powerful in kind of embodying this idea of both S saying, you know what, like I really didn't have a lot of time this month to create something. So I did something that I was like, I can use crayons. I just need a piece of paper, and then I need my pile of laundry that I haven't been able to do. So that's one way of ease. And then I think also the piece of paper shows how they went from this rigid structure of what they saw schooling to be to these kind of drawings and this like landscape of play, and representing like I can live off the lines. I don't have to live in such a rigid way, and giving themselves permission to do that. And I feel S's dream map connects in some cool ways with what T did. So these are the 3 dream maps they did throughout the project. The first one is on the left, and they described it as being something they spent a lot of time on. They were like, Lindsay, I wanted to make something really aesthetically beautiful. I like had this written text, I had drawing, I did this kind of like poem, like found word poem thing, visual poem. And then they said, for the second one, they're like, I was having terrible chronic health flares. I could barely get out of bed. And I felt like I was kind of failing at this project because I had to create something, and I was worried that I wasn't doing enough. And they're like, you know what? I'm actually just going to take a picture of a quilt that someone in my family made that holds a lot of significance. And I just want to highlight like the texture and what it means to hold it. And for me, this idea of kind of like holding something that's soft, giving space for ease, and just allowing myself to be in bed is something that's really important. And then in the third dream map, which was the piece that was, the prompt was actually, how do you kind of imagine a soft curriculum? They took a picture of a kitchen, which is associated with this kind of disability community that they're part of. It's like a communal kitchen where a lot of people come together and they make meals and they hold space together. And there's like the guitar and there's the flowers, and it represents a really beautiful space for them with lots of memories. They wrote this poem on a piece of kind of scrap paper. And they were again like, I'm going to try to not do something that's super aesthetically beautiful. I'm not going to try to put it on a nicer piece of paper. I'm just going to let it be and let it be fine that it's on this like scrap piece of paper. So they wrote, today, kids, we will learn what it takes to have a healthy body, or maybe we won't, because our meds aren't quite right. Today, kids, we will learn how to be slow in a world that pushes our bodies fast and hard, well past our gentle limits. Or maybe we will learn just how to breathe once or twice, to release a fraction of the pain our lungs hold, of the grief caught in our throats, of the exhaustion in our bones. Today, kids, we will learn how to unlearn the harsh limits of deadlines that would rather us dead than unproductive. Today, let us learn that sick bodies are not disposable. So I think this piece was really powerful for the group when they shared it as well. And it was sort of, again, building off of this theme, like, what would it look like if we could just show up when we're not all composed and all together? And what does it also mean when you have a body that doesn't allow you to show up all the time when you're feeling super composed? And how might that be a philosophy or an approach or an orientation that we could bring into education systems? The second kind of value or piece for curriculum relates to this idea that softness is a privilege and a want. And a lot of the people talked about softness as something that's racialized. So for one of the participants, C, who is a second generation Chinese, non-binary queer student, they talked about how important it was to like bend this idea of softness, because as an East Asian person who's perceived as a woman, they're expected to be like docile, and they really hate that. And they're like, I don't want to come into spaces and have this imposed expectation that I'm just going to be like passive, or I'm going to be this, or I'm going to be that. And other folks talked about how, because this was Jay in particular, because as a kid, they were perceived as more kind of masculine in relation to them being brown and being fat. They said, like, I wasn't perceived as someone who was kind of soft, because people saw me as this like dangerous other. And they talked about being kind of like in the GTA where they live now, they're like, I'm more racially ambiguous, but where I grew up, I was one of the darkest kids, right? And how I was perceived was very different. And F, who's a Métis young person who was a sex worker, who dropped out of school, who discussed having various forms of trauma, talked about like, like, Lindsay, I didn't have a very soft life. Like, I was experiencing a lot of trauma. So softness, again, I think an important piece of as a value is we can't just be like, everybody should just be soft, right? Like, no, we can't impose that on people. We can't say, oh, just be tender, be vulnerable, because it's actually really harmful and dangerous for people to be vulnerable in spaces where they're being like brutalized and harm is being perpetuated against them, right? So it has to be nuanced. It has to be like, how can we make these institutions softer? How can we allow for more care and more tenderness? And then the final point that I'll say, and I'll kind of wrap up because I've been talking forever, is that it's probably really important for us to have grace for the fact that we might want to show up and be soft, but we might not actually be able to, or it might kind of fall flat because it's really difficult to be soft. One of the people in the study said to me, they're like, Lindsay, I think I'm realizing through this project that like softness is work. Like you can't just wake up and be like, oh, I'm going to be like so soft and tender. Like there's a lot of deconditioning. There's a lot of care labor to try to make a space feel good for people. And so it's a kind of labor. And for a lot of people, as I mentioned at the beginning, they grew up thinking that softness or things that they associate with being femme is being weak, right? Being vulnerable is a form of weakness. And so kind of relearning that relationship. And I'll just end with this dream map from F and something that they said about it, which I think exemplifies this idea that like, it's a struggle. It's a struggle to be soft. So this is what they said. I was so stressed out. I am so stressed out. I am realizing that I exist in a perpetual state of stress, is like a perpetual state of kind of trauma response. Like I have a lot of things going on and I want to give 100% all the time. And then I felt myself feeling really conflicted and kind of just like almost depressed because I was like, I feel really passionate about this. Like what you're doing here, Lindsay. Like I think it's a really important project and it's so in alignment with things that I'm thinking about already. But I'm struggling to let myself engage in an imperfect way or a sustainable way or a human way. And they said this about how much of a struggle it was to create this beautiful, right? Absolutely stunning piece of art, which they perceived and they spoke about in the group as something that they weren't really happy about, that they didn't, So the whole invitation to make bad art or to not care about the aesthetic of how it looked, it was one of the biggest struggles of the project because people came and they're like, I don't know, like I wanted it to look like this. I wanted it to look like that. So there were a lot of challenges for just showing up and allowing things to be how they are. And so I think that's a piece of maybe a curriculum for softness, is giving people the room and the space to try out and then finding ways of like showing up and listening to the struggle, because everyone in the group showed up for F in that moment and was like, thank you so much for creating this. Like, this was wonderful. And, it's okay. It also doesn't have to look beautiful, right? Like it is beautiful, but it doesn't have to, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to stop there because I know I've been chatting for a long time. Thank you so much.